Good morning and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. My name is Bhante Suddhāso, and this morning we'll be looking at a chapter from the Dhammapada, one of the collections of short sayings of the Buddha. So we'll start with paying homage to the Buddha, and then I'll read through the verses and give some explanation. And then if there's any questions, I'll respond to questions at the end. So please feel free to type in questions at any time. So we'll start with homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So here we're looking at the Dhammapada Jaravaga, which is the chapter on decay, decrepitude, aging. And it says verses 146 to 156 from the Dhammapada. So just brief context, the Dhammapada is a collection of short poems of the Buddha, mostly short 4-line poems. Some of them are grouped into longer sections, but most of them are just 4 lines, so very brief statements. And the Dhammapada tends to have a lot of detail and references to other things in the suttas. So I usually don't recommend starting with the Dhammapada if somebody's new to the suttas. I recommend saving the Dhammapada until after you've read a large volume of longer discourses, because then one will have the proper context for understanding what the Dhammapada is talking about. But once one has a good understanding of the Dhamma, then the Dhammapada can be really, really delightful, because you'll understand the references the Buddha is making. So we'll start with reading through some of these verses, and I'll say a few words about the verses as we go through. So starting with the first one, so this is Dhammapada 146. And I'm looking at my own translation here, by the way. So on Sutta Central, there's many different translations of these verses available. So on this occasion, I'm looking at my own translation from a few years ago. So the first verse, verse 146, says, "Who can laugh, who can delight, since this is always on fire? Obscured by darkness, you do not search for light." So this first line, "Who can laugh, who can delight, since this is always on fire?" So this is referring to other places in the suttas where the Buddha describes our experience as being on fire. So one of the more well-known examples of this is the Adityapariyaya Sutta, commonly called the fire discourse or fire sermon, which actually starts off with the Buddha saying, "Sabbang aditang," which means everything is on fire. And he says the eye is on fire, the nose is on fire, the tongue is on fire, etc. So sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and thought are on fire. All the sensations that we experience are on fire. Basically everything within our whole domain of experience is on fire. And he says it's on fire with what? It's on fire with greed, hatred, and delusion. It's on fire with decrepitude, sickness, and death. It's on fire with the fire of suffering. And fire is also used elsewhere in the suttas as a metaphorical representation for our own defilements. So how greed, hatred, and delusion are constantly burning us up from the inside out. How the mind is constantly tormented, like somebody burning alive. In the same way, the mind is tormented by the fires of greed, hatred, and delusion. So here, when the Buddha is saying, this is always on fire, that's what he's talking about. He's talking about how our mind is always on fire with defilements. It's always on fire with greed, hatred, and delusion, which then creates this painful torment that saturates our experience of reality. So then he's saying, like, who can laugh, who can delight, since this is always on fire? So when the mind is always tormented by greed, hatred, and delusion, it's difficult to to find joy in life. It's difficult to appreciate a life as it is, to appreciate anything. And then he makes the metaphor, obscured by darkness, you do not search for light. So darkness and light is another metaphorical pair that we find in the suttas. Darkness represents ignorance, delusion, and light represents wisdom, insight, understanding. So here again, fire is representing defilement, so the mind being burned by greed and hatred, and then darkness is delusion, ignorance, not understanding the Four Noble Truths, not understanding the nature of reality. So what we should do is try to put out the fire and search for light, search for the light of wisdom. Then the next verse here, so I think this is verse 147. This one says, see that the mind has been made a puppet, damaged with arrogance, afflicted with excessive thought, lacking stability and composure. I actually find this really cute. So the first one, see that the mind has been made a puppet. So passa chittikatang bimbang. And you'll see different translations of this verse. And this is generally true of the Dhammapada, by the way. So the Dhammapada, because of the way that the Dhammapada verses are structured, they tend to be open to a wide range of interpretation. So the Dhammapada is the most heavily translated text from the Pali Canon. So it's the text that's been translated the most number of times by the widest number of different translators. And those different translations can be wildly different from each other. And in some cases, that's just because of bad translation. In some cases, it's just that a particular translator didn't really understand the verse very well. But often the differences in translation is because the verses themselves can be translated in many different ways. There's many different ways of understanding what the meaning of the words are and how they fit together, and how to then render that into a sensible English statement. So this first line, so for example, in my translation, it says, see that the mind has been made a puppet. So this is, passa means see, chitta is mind, katang is made, and bimbang is puppet. So it's very, very literal, like see that the mind has been made a puppet. So what is a puppet? So if you think of a puppet on strings, it's something that seems to be moving of its own accord, but actually it's controlled. It's controlled by the puppet master. It's being pulled around by these little strings. So in the same way, we think that we're free. We think that we're making our own choices, but actually we're constantly being pulled by the strings of our desires. So these strong impulses and cravings and urges that appear in the mind. And a lot of that is coming from external conditioning. So somebody sees a commercial on TV for a certain kind of shampoo, and then they think, oh, I want to get that shampoo. It's like, well, no, you don't want to get it. That's just the puppet master pulling the strings. That urge arising within your mind, that's not you. That's the influence of external conditioning inflaming your internal tendency towards desire. So you think like, oh, this is me, this is who I am doing what I want. But actually, you're just a puppet. Your mind is just a puppet being paraded around by desire and delusion. So it's really important to really question our desires and preferences and really ask, where are they coming from? Is this actually who we are, or is this just the product of external conditioning meeting with our internal tendency towards craving? Then the next line, damaged with arrogance. So the mind has been is damaged with arrogance, afflicted with arrogance. So I also find this really cute. So arrogance, this mind which is puffed up, which is self-obsessed. And again, often we think like, oh, it's good to have good self-esteem. And it's like, well, yeah, of course it is. It's good to have good self-esteem. So a sense of positive self-worth connected with the Dhamma, that's a good thing. Positive self-worth based on wholesome things. But often what we're actually doing as we're going through life is we just have this really strong self-obsession, this really strong fixation on me, this self-centeredness. And that self-centeredness is like a wound. It's like an injury. It just damages the mind. In fact, the source of all of our suffering is our self-centeredness. And Buddhism is ultimately all about eliminating our self-centeredness, getting rid of self-centeredness. So damaged with arrogance. Then the next line is afflicted with excessive thought. So aturang bahu sankappang. Bahu sankappa means lots of thinking, lots of thoughts. Again, the mind is afflicted with excessive thought. So we're trying to cultivate a quiet mind, a wise mind, an alert mind, a peaceful mind, a stable mind. And this is something that we do through the development of mindfulness, concentration, and equanimity. So both during meditation practice and also outside of it. So again, the Buddha here is pointing out that thinking a lot is like being diseased. So the word atura means a disease. And he says, lacking stability and composure. So the mind is like a puppet. So we're being puppeted around by our desires, our conditioning, damaged with arrogance. So the mind is flawed. It's corrupted by self-centeredness. Afflicted with excessive thought. So the mind is tormented with too much thinking. We keep our mind too noisy, too busy. We need to make the mind more quiet. And lacking stability and composure. So our mind is fickle. It's constantly flailing around. So here the Buddha is clearly laying out exactly what's going wrong with our mind and exactly why we need to constantly train the mind in mindfulness, concentration, equanimity, serenity, joy. So the importance of cultivating our meditation practice. Then the next verse, the Buddha says, this body is decrepit, fragile, a nest of disease, a putrid heap that falls apart, since life ends in death. So this fairly straightforward. There's not a lot of explanation needed. So just a reminder of the inevitability of death, but more importantly, it's a reminder that this body is decaying. This body is falling apart. Actually, the peak of physical health is at about the age of 25. That's what scientists are saying these days. And after the age of 25, your body starts gradually decaying, gradually falling apart. So it's all downhill after that point. Things just keep getting worse. But this is the nature of the body. The nature of the body is that it's subject to decay, it's subject to affliction, to disease, to problems. And the Buddha said we should constantly remind ourselves of this every day so that we become accustomed to this reality, so that we're not bothered by this reality. And so then when the body is sick or injured, then we recognize, oh, that's just the nature of things. There isn't actually a problem here. Often when people get sick, they get really upset of like, oh, why is this happening to me? This shouldn't be happening. This is so awful. But actually it should be happening because this is the nature of bodies. The nature of bodies is to get sick. The nature of bodies is to fall apart, to decay. Their nature is that they are fragile and subject to disintegration. Then the next verse, continuing on recollection of death, the next one says, set aside like gourds in autumn. When seeing these faded bones, what delight can there be? So here he's talking about corpse contemplation. So if you look at the skeleton of a dead being, and you recognize that this body is becoming like that body. The Buddha said whenever we see a dead body, so maybe you're walking down the street and you see an animal that's been hit by a car. So you see a dead body in the road. The Buddha said when we see a dead body, we should think this body is becoming like that body. This body is not exempt from that fate. So when you see a dead body, you think, oh, this body, the one that I think of as mine, is also dying. It's also going to wind up like that. So bloody bones lying on the ground. Same thing will happen to this body. And so he says, when seeing these faded bones, what delight can there be? And so in other words, when we recognize that this body is unreliable and destined for death, then we should not be seeking delight in the body. We shouldn't be basing our happiness upon our body, because our body is not reliable. It's not a dependable source of happiness. The pleasure that comes through the body is not reliable. And the imagery of set aside like gourds in autumn, actually what that makes me think of is after Halloween. So like for Halloween in this country, people carve pumpkins and like carve pumpkins into all these beautiful art and set it out so all their neighbors can see their pumpkin art. And then the next few days after Halloween, there's just these like rotting, collapsing pumpkins sitting out everywhere, and eventually they just get thrown away or eaten by the deer or something. So it's the same, like we have these bodies and we're like, oh, my body is so beautiful and so fresh and so healthy and so young, and well, just wait a little bit. And pretty soon it'll be like those Halloween pumpkins a few days after Halloween, so rotting and collapsing and falling apart. Like that's the nature of these bodies. So it's important not to base our happiness on the youth and health of the body, not to base our happiness on the physical pleasure of the body, because it's not reliable. Then the next verse, the Buddha says, like a city made of bones, wrapped in meat and blood, a place of decay and death, conceit and contempt. This is just delicious. So here he's talking again about the body. So giving us a different way of looking at our body. Again, rather than relating to our body as a source of pleasant sensations, instead he's saying to see it as a city made of bones, wrapped in meat and blood. So first off, just being realistic. What is this? What is this thing that we're inhabiting? It's a bunch of, it's built up of bones, and it's full of meat and blood. So a big bloody chunk of meat. That's what this is. Just being realistic here. A place of decay and death. Again, we tend to think of our body as a source of pleasure and happiness. But actually what's really going on here is that the body is decaying and dying. So the purpose of this is to not get caught up in an inaccurate or flawed relationship to our body, but rather to see it for what it is, so that we don't become attached to our body. We let go of the attachment that we have to our body. A place of conceit and contempt. So conceit, we have so much arrogance related to our body, so much self-identity connected with our body. And this is one of the really critical things that we need to work on in our Buddhist practice, is letting go of identification with the body. So recognizing how we tend to have this strong identity of thinking, I am this body is me, this body is mine, this body is who I am. And that's exactly why what happens with the body is so much suffering for us. It's because we identify as the body. Because we think this body is me, then whatever happens to the body, we take it personally. It bothers us. But when we see that this body is not me, then we recognize that what's happening with the body is just nature. It's just natural conditions. And we're not bothered by it. Just as we're not bothered by the leaves decaying and falling off the trees in the autumn. In the same way, we're not bothered by this body getting old and decrepit, because we know that it's not me. It's not who I am. Then the next verse, the Buddha says, even splendid royal chariots wear out. so too this body decays. But the true Dhamma never decays. It is made known by those who are peaceful and virtuous. So here again, the Buddha is making this point of the unreliability of the body. So he's saying how even the most splendid things in the world eventually wear out. So here he's talking about splendid royal chariots. These days we might say fancy cars. So even the fanciest sports cars eventually wear out. And so too this body. The nature of this body is to decay, to wear out, to get old and decrepit. But he's saying there's something which never decays. There's something which never becomes worse over time. There's something which is always splendid, always magnificent, always vibrant and healthy. And that's the Dhamma. The Dhamma itself is something which never gets old, never gets decrepit. So this is what we should actually be seeking refuge in. This is what we should be really placing value in. So rather than valuing our young, healthy bodies, then instead we should be valuing the Dhamma itself, that which is not subject to aging and death. Then the next verse, this is switching topic a little bit. The next verse says, "A person who has learned little ages like an ox. Their muscles grow, but their wisdom does not." So a very short verse here, which I also find delightful. So a person who has learned little ages like an ox. Their muscles grow, but their wisdom does not. So this is emphasizing the importance of learning the Dhamma. So again, you can see somebody who they're not interested in spiritual practice. They're not interested in developing wisdom. And maybe they spend a lot of time building up their physical health, their physical strength, but their wisdom does not grow. They do not develop the strength of wisdom. They might develop a strong body for a little while. Of course, that will also fade as they get older. They might develop a strong body, but they do not develop strong wisdom. So it's really important to learn the Dhamma and develop a wise, clear understanding and experience of the Dhamma, because this is what will actually give us strength in old age. So we can't rely on our body to be strong in old age. But if we build up our wisdom over our life, then that strength of wisdom will carry us through the challenges of old age. It's actually really noticeable to see people who have no spiritual practice. When they start to get old, it tends to be really difficult for them. Aging is very, very challenging if somebody has no spirituality at all. But somebody with a strong spiritual practice tends to face old age with dignity and composure. And that's because they've spent a lot of time building up wisdom, building up wholesome qualities of heart, which gives them the ability to face old age with serenity and clarity. And next we have a pair of verses which are quite famous. So this next pair of verses is commonly attributed to the Buddha right after the Buddha attained awakening. So this is commonly believed to be a reflection that the Buddha made immediately after he attained full awakening. So I'll read through it and then explain it because it's all metaphor. So it says, "Wandering through many lives, seeking but not finding the builder of this house, repeatedly experiencing the suffering of birth. House builder, you have been seen. You will build no house again. All your rafters are broken, the roof peak dismantled. The mind has gone to the unconditioned. The elimination of craving has been reached." So this is, again, a very famous verse. So it's the verse starting Aneka Jati Sangsarang, which is commonly chanted in Theravada Buddhist monasteries. So the first line is talking about the Buddha recollecting his past lives, recollecting how through many, many lives he had died and been reborn and lived for a while and died again and was reborn again and lived for a while and died again and was reborn again, just constantly cycling through different lives, different states of existence. And in many of those lives, engaging in a spiritual quest, trying to understand what was creating these experiences, trying to understand the nature of sentient experience. So that's when he says, wandering through many lives, seeking but not finding the builder of this house. That's what he's talking about. How he was remembering that he had died and been reborn so many times. And even in the lives where he was trying to cultivate a spiritual practice, he didn't find the answers. He didn't find awakening. Even though he was trying, he didn't find awakening. But then the second set of verses, house builder, you have been seen. So what this means is that he's finally seen what it is that creates this painful experience of delusional existence. He's finally seen the craving and delusion, which generates this painful cycle of rebirth. He says, you will build no house again. In other words, he's clearly broken, because he's clearly seen the nature of craving and delusion, then it's lost its power. So he's no longer subject to the cycle of rebirth. That's what it means when he says, you will build no house again. It means that he's free from the cycle of rebirth. He says, all your rafters are broken, the roof peak dismantled. So in other words, all of the specific manifestations of desire and aversion have been completely removed from his mind. So kind of like when they tear down a building and they remove all the components of the building and clear everything away and there's nothing left. It says in the same way, he's completely removed all the desire and aversion, all the defilements and corruptions from his mind. They've all been dismantled and taken down and removed. And there's nothing left there at all. Next he says, the mind has gone to the unconditioned. So the unconditioned is the... usually we use the word asankata. In this place, it's visankara, which has the same basic meaning. So the mind has gone to the unconditioned. This means the mind has reached nibbana. The mind has clearly seen nibbana. The mind has recognized the underlying aspect of reality, which is beyond specific objects or specific conditions. So he's clearly seen the fundamental emptiness of all things. And with that clear recognition, then the mind is completely free of all craving, completely free of all defilement. Okay. And then there's one last pair of verses here, and then that'll be it for this chapter. This last pair of verses says, those who have neither lived a spiritual life nor acquired wealth during their youth waste away like old herons by a fishless pond. And the next verse, on a similar note, says, those who have neither lived a spiritual life nor acquired wealth during their youth lie around like wasted arrows, lamenting the past. So here the Buddha is talking about how people who haven't done anything with their lives. So they've neither pursued a spiritual path, so done something truly meaningful, truly valuable, cultivating a spiritual life, but they also haven't even accumulated ordinary worldly wealth. They haven't even done anything of worldly benefit. So someone who's really wasted their life, they wasted their life in the most profound sense because they haven't developed a spiritual practice, but they've also wasted their life in a mundane worldly sense as well. They haven't pursued worldly wealth either. So someone who's really completely wasted their life, they haven't done anything meaningful at all. He says it's like old herons by a fishless pond. So decrepit old birds with no food, or wasted arrows, lamenting the past. So wasted arrow gives you this sense of like you had a shot, but you failed. You had a shot, but you didn't hit the mark. So of course, ideally, we're cultivating a spiritual practice. We're doing the highest good with our life, which is the development of the limitless wisdom and compassion of the awakened mind. But failing that, we should at least try to do good in the world. We should at least try to find some way to be of benefit to others with what we can do, with what we're able to achieve within our life. So that then when we get old, we actually have something good to remember. We can reflect on our life with a sense of appreciation of the goodness that we've done. So that's the end of this chapter. So I think we'll go ahead and respect the Buddha's words with 3 sadhus, and then I'll see if there's any questions. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And hello to all the people joining in online. Hello to Gita, Christina, Manal, Maria, Marielle, Yankee, Nico, Richard, Usha, Mini, Bhumika, Karuna, Kit, Stevie, Molika, Olga, Ko, Devansh, Jay, Amaranta, Stevie, Meredith, and BC. Good to see all of you. Lovely to see lots of people joining in online. And let's see if there's any questions here. So Devant says, please tell me how to get rid of past karma, anger, lust, making me weak day by day. So it's a little bit off topic. Good question, but a bit off topic. So Devansh, if you can bring that to Monk Chat this Friday evening. So every Friday evening we have our open Q&A where you can ask any kind of question. And Stevie says, my dog companion of 12 years passed away 24 hours ago. So my condolences, Stevie. That's always a difficult thing when a close friend passes away like that. And Stevie says, I stayed with her body for 2 hours after death. That's good. She was blessed by the monks at my temple in January. Good. I don't know what else to do for her. So when a loved one passes away, what we commonly do in Buddhist tradition is that you perform acts of generosity and dedicate the merit of those acts of generosity to the one who's passed away. So you might go to the temple and offer food. You might volunteer at a local charity. Look for good things to do, acts of generosity and kindness. And every time you do that, think of your friend who passed away and dedicate the goodness of it to that person, wishing may they see this good deed, may they appreciate this good deed, may they also receive the good karma of this good deed. That's the main thing that you can do. Also, just constantly wishing for them to have good conditions in their next life, good conditions for practicing the Dhamma. Whenever you do any Buddhist service in particular, so any bowing, chanting, meditation, then call up the memory of your friend and wish that they also be in good conditions for practicing the Dhamma. These are some things you can do. And BC says, if for no other reason, facing advanced age and death with dignity is one of the great gifts one can give to younger family members. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we do our spiritual practice not only for ourselves, but also for the benefit of everyone else in our life. So training the mind not only makes ourselves happier, but it also sets an example for the people around us, showing them that it is possible to train the mind in this way. And Amaranta says, why does the Buddha say the one who built the house? Who is that? So I thought I explained this, but I'll give a bit more explanation. So when he's saying the house builder is craving and delusion. So the house is a metaphor for our life. So the house represents our body and mind. So what is it that keeps building this body and mind over and over and over again? What keeps building this body and mind is desire and delusion. So that's the house builder. The house builder is desire and delusion. Fundamentally, the house builder is the delusion of self-existence. That's the core component, which then everything else builds on. That's the foundation of the house. The foundation of the house is the delusion of self-existence. And then all of our specific desires and aversions build on top of that to make up a life, to make a body and mind during one state of existence. And then at the end of our life, because we still have that foundation of delusion of self-existence, then we just keep building again. We just keep building another construct of desire and delusion, which just keeps manifesting as life after life after life. And Randall says, how can I de-identify with the body, yet appreciate and care for my body according to the Buddha? Well, because your body is a useful tool for helping you attain awakening. So a healthy body, it's easier to meditate when you have a healthy body. So it's good to keep your body fairly healthy. So the Buddha says that we use food in order to keep our body alive and healthy, so that we can practice well. This is what the Buddha said we should reflect every day before eating. So in many monasteries, before having lunch every day, we recollect, like, this food is not for fun, not for pleasure, but only to keep the body alive and healthy, so we can continue our spiritual practice. So it's that reminder that taking care of our body is helpful for continuing our practice well. So the body is not me, it's not mine, but if I take good care of it, then it will help with practicing the spiritual path. And Didi says, in the first paragraph where it talks about seeing the body as it is, it reminds me of the 7 profitable perceptions that is taught by the Buddha. There's a lot of lists in the Buddha's teaching, and there's a lot of lists of 7. So I'm not familiar with the list of 7 you're talking about. So maybe if you could say what that list is, then I would recognize it. And Didi says, how does one do perception of asubha correctly? That's a little off topic, but it's somewhat related to some of these verses here. So the word asubha literally means non-beauty. It's often mistranslated as repulsiveness or ugliness or unattractiveness or things like that. But asubha means non-beauty. So asubha practice simply means to see the body as not beautiful. It's not ugly either. It's just a body. What is a body? It's dirt, water, heat, and air. That's it. There's nothing either beautiful or ugly here. Like, this is literally just a warm, wet piece of dirt. Or as the body put it in here, it's a bundle of bones wrapped up in meat and blood. So there's nothing beautiful or anything ugly. So the practice of asubha is to be clearly aware of the body as it actually is, which is just a piece of nature. The body is really no different from a tree or a stone or a pile of dirt. There's really nothing special about the body. It's not beautiful and it's not ugly. So the purpose of asubha is to see the body in a calm, peaceful way. So not with the desire and attachment that comes from seeing things as beautiful, but also not with the disgust and hatred that comes with seeing things as ugly. Instead, we want to see bodies without the distortion of beauty, without the distorted perception of beauty. Okay. Indeed, he says, knowing the body is subject to old age, sickness, and death, one might heard that say they understood it, for it's no-brainer. How does one contemplate that correctly to understand the magnitude? Well, you need to constantly remind yourself. Constantly remind yourself of the reality of old age, sickness, and death. Because, again, we think we know. We think we know that we're subject to old age, sickness, and death, but we keep acting like it's not going to happen. We keep acting like we're going to be, we keep acting like we're going to live forever. And then when we actually notice we're getting sick or we're getting old, then we think it's a disaster. So this is why the Buddha said we should remind ourselves of these things every day. Actually, I would say constantly, all day long. Actually, I think about death all day long. We should constantly be reminding ourselves of the reality of aging, sickness, death, and loss, and karma. So the 5 things: aging, sickness, death, loss, and karma. The 5 things the Buddha said we should remind ourselves of every day. And I would say not just once a day, but repeatedly throughout the day. And constantly thinking about and contemplating the reality of these things. Then it starts to settle in. And Mini says, do the Brahmas from Suddhavasa teach other devas and humans as well? There's at least one recorded case in the Pali Canon of a Brahma Deva from the Suddhavasa talking to a human, a bhikkhu. But I'm not actually aware of other cases where it's specifically mentioned. But that is at least one case, so it does seem to be possible. It does seem to happen. And Anonymous here says, this is a bit off topic, says, is it okay to do only meditation with chanting the divine name? Is reading scripture and religious teaching necessary? It's a bit off topic, but briefly speaking, yes, you do need to read scriptures and the religious teachings. Yes, you do. The Buddha said right view comes first. Right view is the precedent of all wholesome things. So yeah, you need to study the Dhamma to make sure that you understand it correctly. Otherwise, you might think you know how to practice, but you might not be practicing correctly. So you really need to develop right view through study. And Minnie says, where do arhants go after parinibbana? Again, this is quite off topic, and it's also a meaningless question. The Buddha himself said that this question is meaningless. When somebody asked him this question, he said the question doesn't make sense. It doesn't apply. It's the question itself is utterly nonsensical. But if you bring this on Friday, Monk Chat on Friday, I'll give a more detailed answer. And Didi says, I was referring to the Dutiya Sanya Sutta in Guttara Nikaya 7.49. Maybe we can talk about this in a future sutta study. So Didi, if you ever want a particular sutta, you can send an email to the monastery requesting a particular sutta, and it might appear in a future sutta study. And S says, in the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, the observation of the 9 phases of the corpse, is that also related to aging and death? I was confused why it is necessary. So that's actually one of the odd things about the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, is the inclusion of the 9 stages of corpse contemplation doesn't really fit with the other meditation practices included in that sutta. So one scholarly theory is that the section on corpse contemplation was added in later. Because the corpse contemplations, they're found elsewhere in the suttas, and they are good practices to do. They just don't really make sense in the Mahasatipatthana Sutta. So I'm actually of the opinion that they probably weren't in the original version of that discourse that the Buddha gave. They were probably added in later. But the 9 corpse contemplations does seem to be something that the Buddha did teach. And you'll notice that the refrain for each one of the 9 corpse contemplations is thinking, this body is like that body. This body is becoming like that body. This body is the same as that body. So it's recognizing that, like when you're looking at a corpse, as I said earlier, when you're looking at a corpse, you should be thinking that this body, the one that I think of as me, this body is becoming like that corpse. it's not exempt from the same fate as that corpse. That's the main point of the contemplations, the corpse contemplations. So yeah, it's about recollection of death, and also seeing the body as it actually is. So the body is just part of earth. It's just part of the earth. The body is just dirt, water, heat, and air. And when the body dies, then it will decompose and mix back in with nature. It's what it came from, and that's what it goes back to. It's what it's always been part of. It's just part of nature. And S says, those are scary. They're only scary if you're afraid of death. If you're not afraid of death, then the corpse contemplations are not scary. I don't find them scary at all. I actually find them kind of cute. And Mini says, in Tusita, are there two genders? So again, this is quite off topic, so better to bring that to Friday evening mug chat. And that's the last question. So I think we'll go ahead and wrap up at this time with 3 more sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you all next time.